Hello, dear listeners. Today, we will dive into a horror story titled Supernatural Vigilante Association, The Time Traveler. Part 1. I stood on the roof of the derelict tower block, the cold night sky above me as I waited impatiently for my source to arrive. Glancing upwards, I failed to see a single star due to light pollution, and I found this depressing. Suffocating even. The crescent moon was visible, however, if barely. Its dim light gave me some comfort, a temporary respite from the chaos occurring below me. Reluctantly, I gazed downwards at the burning city, listening to the terrible cacophony of frantic shouts, trampling feet, beeping horns, distant sirens, and sporadic gunfire. All this was interspersed with the far-off din of rotor blades, as police helicopters hovered over the city like hungry insects, their spotlights focusing on trouble spots dotted across the boroughs. I shook my head in disgust as the smoke from the burning buildings and vehicles hit my nostrils. This city, my hometown, had once again been engulfed by anarchy and violence, as rioting had broken out across the metropolis, a fiery chaos which the city's police were seemingly unable to contain. I felt sick to my stomach whilst observing these violent scenes from my high viewing point. This rioting was undoubtedly worse than the violence which broke out several months back. The city was burning and it was uncertain whether the community would ever recover. But this wasn't what bothered me the most. What really ate away at me was the guilt I felt, because I realized I was at least partly responsible for this mess. The stories I'd published, the tales of the SVA and its secretive operatives, my work had stirred something in people, a simmering resentment and anger which had been lingering just below the surface, waiting to explode. Why had I chased this story? What had I hoped to achieve? Was it anything more than naked personal ambition? I'd been asking myself these questions since my last interview with Quinn, which had ended in tragedy. But it wasn't about me anymore. I had never been a supporter of the Supernatural Vigilante Association. In fact, I'd always condemned their actions and entire philosophy. But my journalism unfortunately had the opposite effect to what I intended. Instead of exposing the brutal organization for what they were, I'd breathed fresh life into a dying beast. The mobs rampaging through the streets had their chance, shouting furiously and passionately as they attacked police cars and burnt down City Hall, all whilst crying, "Free Tabitha, Quinn Lives, Mandrake for President, and victory to the SVA." I wanted to portray these vigilantes as flawed human beings who'd taken the wrong path, not to garner sympathy for them. But that's what had happened. And of course, Mandrake was more than willing to take advantage of this surge in support, stoking the fires with his own unique brand of ultra-violence. To be fair, the vigilante leader was still on the run and his capabilities were limited. Mandrake no longer had an army of superhumans under his command, as most of his former soldiers were either dead or in prison. Nevertheless, he wasn't entirely without resources. I'd closely followed the news reports over the last few days and had noted attacks which matched Mandrake's unique fingerprint: a rapist castrated, a corrupt cop assassinated, a mob bar-bombed. Even amongst all this chaos, Mandrake could still make his mark. The whole ugly scenario sickened me, and I'd spent many sleepless nights questioning why I'd ever started this investigation. Just then I felt the first cold drops of rain falling on my head as I stood on the rooftop pondering my unfortunate situation. Looking up, I saw dark clouds forming in the night sky, cursing as I tightened my coat and shivered. What the hell was I doing here? Why had I even come tonight? Good questions, although unfortunately I didn't have good answers. It wasn't about the story anymore. Not really. Sure, I was curious to meet the mysterious vigilante Mandrake had lined up for me. Still, I no longer craved fame, recognition, or a Pulitzer. What I really wanted was for this nightmare to end. My exhausted brain was hardly thinking logically by this point, but I believed this chaos would only end when Mandrake was brought down. The vigilante put himself at risk every time he came out of hiding to meet me, so perhaps this would be the time he got caught. I considered this whilst retreating towards the staircase, seeking shelter from the coming deluge. The weather was vile, but perhaps the rain would quell the fires. Why had Mandrake chosen this location for our meet? Sure, the views were fantastic, if you appreciated the sight of a city tearing itself apart. But a rooftop was indeed a strange choice. Mandrake had always previously picked venues with at least one clear escape route in case the cops or bounty hunters came knocking. But this derelict tower seemed like a trap with no obvious way out. I'd had to climb 50 flights of stairs just to get up here, leaving me exhausted, flustered and irritated. Then again, maybe Mandrake didn't want to get out. He was living on borrowed time after all, and perhaps he'd chosen this lonely rooftop for his last stand, planning to go down in a blaze of glory while I was there as a witness, the ambitious journalist who would write up the graphic details of his heroic demise. The thought brought a cold chill down my spine. I wanted to see Mandrake's reign of terror brought to an end, but would prefer he was arrested and put on trial rather than turned into a martyr. And I certainly didn't want to be caught in the crossfire if and when bullets started flying. In that moment I did seriously consider abandoning this foolhardy enterprise, but suddenly I heard heavy footsteps ascending the staircase and an all too familiar voice calling out to me. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. What a pleasure to see you again." I turned to see a figure ascending the darkened staircase, illuminating the steps before him with the torch function on his phone. Standing tall, I waited until the newcomer's face was lit up before I answered his call. "Mr. Mandrake. I was beginning to worry you wouldn't show up." The vigilante chuckled dryly as he continued his slow ascent. He showed no signs of tiring despite having climbed so many flights of stairs. I looked over my companion with interest as he walked into the light, noting the changes in his appearance and demeanor since our last meeting. On that previous occasion, I was shocked at how far Mandrake had deteriorated. He'd looked disheveled and exhausted, on edge and close to breaking point. Honestly, I feared Quinn's suicide might finish him off. But the Mandrake now stood before me looked like a man renewed, his eyes bright with fiery passion and with a charismatic smile plastered across his face. I noticed how he no longer wore his usual tailored suit, instead being dressed all in black with a leather jacket and a polo neck up to his chin. Perhaps this was his wartime uniform. Mandrake's grin widened as he walked up the final steps to meet me, holding out his hand in a show of friendship whilst doing so. "Now Mr. Carter, I thought you knew me better than that. I wouldn't miss our meeting for the world." I took his hand to shake, even though it made me uncomfortable. I couldn't help wondering how many lives those hands had taken. I felt relieved whenever I was able to pull away from his sweaty palm. "Interesting choice for a meeting place," I said sarcastically, whilst looking the killer straight in his dark eyes. Mandrake didn't blink as he spoke his answer. "The building is derelict and away from prying eyes. True, the roof is open to the elements, not to mention police helicopters. But I have a room ready for us, one floor down." I nodded my head, hardly surprised at the last-minute change of venue. Mandrake liked to keep me on my toes, to remind me he was in control. But I had a trump card up my sleeve: information. You see, I'd been doing a lot of digging since the fateful night of the Quinn interview, and I'd learned something very important: Mandrake's true identity and his family history. I could reveal the vigilante's secret at any time, and yet, I hesitated to do so, because I feared how he'd respond. "Please follow me," Mandrake instructed. And so I did, walking after him and down the staircase. The room Mandrake had organized for our meet wasn't much to look at: a dark, damp and empty office space littered with overturned furniture and assorted junk spread across the stained carpet. From the wide windows we could still see the chaos on the streets below, the city-wide riots which showed little signs of abating. We sat facing each other across a desk illuminated by a battery-powered lantern placed upon it. "So, here we are again," Mandrake said with a thin smile. "I do hope this meeting goes better than our last." I noted a sadness in his eyes despite the grin on his lips, and I could relate. Mandrake and I had a shared grief now. We'd both been witness to Quinn's tragic death, as the troubled vigilante blew his brains out mere seconds after delivering his final confession. It chilled me to think back to that fateful night as I recalled the horrific sight of the medalist's still warm body sprawled in the back of his van. I didn't comment, however, instead glancing out the window at the ongoing rioting. Sadly, the rain had only been a brief shower, and so the fires still burned fiercely, their black smoke rising into an even blacker sky. "I suppose this makes you happy," I muttered bitterly whilst glaring back at Mandrake. The vigilante's eyes narrowed and his smile disappeared as he delivered a thoughtful reply. "My feelings are mixed, Mr. Carter. You think anarchy and senseless violence pleases me, but this simply isn't the case. I have dedicated my life to fighting for justice, after all," he chuckled softly before continuing. "Still, I can't say it's not satisfying to observe the cops and feds who've spent so long pursuing me. And now they're under attack, stretched to breaking point as a result of their own brutality and incompetence. But I believe this is only the beginning. Their whole rotten and corrupt system is collapsing in front of our very eyes. This is a revolution, Mr. Carter. The people are furious and hungry for change. And they know who is here to save them. It's on their lips and in their chants, SVA, Mandrake. They know that I am the one to lead them to the promised land. To a bright future where justice is a reality, and not just an empty word." Mandrake's voice had risen to a near crescendo by this point, and I genuinely feared for his sanity. The vigilante was clearly suffering from delusions of grandeur, and possibly even a messiah complex. Did he truly believe these riots were all for him? That he could overthrow the government and take control? This was total madness. As I looked into Mandrake's crazed eyes, I felt a strong urge to reveal what I knew about his sordid past. This revelation would certainly burst his bubble. I didn't know how he'd react, but nevertheless I did seriously consider speaking out. But the timing wasn't right. In that moment, I heard footsteps from the far side of the abandoned office, turning my head to see a new figure emerging from the shadows. "Ah, our special guest has arrived," Mandrake exclaimed enthusiastically. "Come join us, comrade." The man who walked out from the shadows was striking and yet somehow unremarkable at the same time. A large man with a long and disheveled dark beard, his sharp blue eyes shone in the dim light as they focused upon me with a chilling intensity. He walked slowly towards the table whilst holding out his huge hand to shake. "Mr. Carter, I am pleased to introduce one of our finest SVA volunteers, Mr. Ralph Fence," said Mandrake. With some apprehension, I stood and shook with Mr. Fence, my own hand being nearly crushed in the process. Fence towered over me, his intense eyes looking me up and down as he sized me up. This tense moment lasted for longer than I would have liked, until eventually Fence grabbed an overturned chair and joined us at the desk. It took me another few seconds before I felt brave enough to ask a question. "Forgive me, Mr. Fence," I said cautiously. "I have studied the history of the Supernatural Vigilante Association since its foundation. But I'm not familiar with your name." I didn't know how Fence would react to the question but was surprised when he bellowed out in laughter. I was baffled, and it was left up to Mandrake to offer an explanation of sorts. "You won't have heard of Fence or his operations, Mr. Carter. He is our most prized asset and we've kept him a closely guarded secret." I raised an eyebrow, surprised but none the wiser following Mandrake's explanation. "I'm afraid I don't follow," was my puzzled reply. Mandrake smiled knowingly before answering. "Well, let me put it this way. Have you ever heard of the Downtown Mall massacre?" I pondered for a moment but drew a blank. "No sir. I know of the mall of course, but I don't recall a massacre or indeed any serious crimes linked to that venue." Mandrake nodded his head smugly and then began to list off facts, as if he were reading from a newspaper or Wikipedia article. The Downtown Mall massacre took place on the 4th of July 2022 while the venue was packed with holiday shoppers. A single gunman with a history of mental health issues entered the premises shortly after 9 a.m., armed with a semi-automatic rifle and 2 handguns. In the space of a mere 17 minutes, the gunman shot 36 members of the public, killing 21 of them. He was then cornered by responding officers and committed suicide by shooting himself through the head. The massacre was the worst mass shooting in our city's history, and many families were forever broken by the scale of their losses. The mood across the desk was somber, but I broke the mood by scoffing in contempt. "Come on, Mandrake. No such event ever took place. You know this." I looked to Mandrake and then to Fence, only to be met with cold stares. "You don't know about the shooting because Mr. Fence went to extraordinary lengths to prevent the massacre from happening." Mandrake answered through clenched teeth. 21 people are alive today because of him, living their lives and spending time with their loved ones. They'll never know what was done to save them, well, not until now. Not until you tell the story, Mr. Carter. I frowned, slightly irritated by the cryptic response. "I still don't understand," I said. Mandrake smiled again before breaking eye contact and sitting up from his chair. "Well, I think it's better if Fence explains it to you himself. I need to check on our security arrangements, so I'll leave you gentlemen to it." With that, Mandrake walked swiftly across the office floor and disappeared into the shadows. And I was left alone with Fence, struggling to hold his hard gaze as I waited for the vigilante to speak. Fence's voice was gruff and deep, as he asked, "So, what do you want to know?" I was somewhat taken aback by his directness and the mysterious way this meeting had transpired. "Well, Mr. Fence," I eventually answered, "I like to start at the beginning with my interviewees. I'm interested in where you come from, when you first identified your special abilities, and how you came to join the SVA." The vigilante nodded his head and stroked his beard, remaining silent for a moment as if deep in thought. I got the impression that Fence was a man of few words, and so I'd need to struggle to get the story out of him. "Well sir, I can't say my childhood was anything special. I wasn't a victim of some horrific crime. My family was normal, loving parents and a comfortable upbringing. I only realized I was different when my grandfather passed away. I was 10. Old enough to understand death but not mature enough to fully process the grief. But that's neither here nor there. What's important is the episode which occurred at my granddaddy's funeral." "Oh, yes?" I said, my curiosity now piqued. Fence was a mystery to me, and I had no idea where this story was going. "Yeah, I was raised in a Catholic family," Fence continued, "and that meant an open casket at the wake. I remember seeing the old-timer inside the lined coffin, his eyes closed, face bloated, and skin looking like wax. The other kids my age were freaked out by the sight of his body, but I was fascinated by it. Call it a morbid curiosity if you will, but I felt the urge to reach out and touch his cheek. I didn't know what to expect. I guess I just wanted to make a connection with my grandfather one last time. But what happened next was beyond my wildest dreams. I saw a glint in Fence's eye and a faint smile beneath his black beard. Clearly, this was a treasured memory for the man. It was terrifying at first, because I didn't understand what had happened to me. You see, one minute I was standing in the back room of the church with a line of mourners behind me, and the next I was transported through time and space to a location and year that was quite impossible. My jaw dropped and heart rate quickened as I looked Fence directly in the eye, trying to find any signs of deceit. I'd heard and reported on some extraordinary SVA stories before, tales of the supernatural and paranormal. But what Fence was saying was out of this world. So, wait, you're saying that you were teleported to another place? I asked in amazement. Yeah. Fence replied calmly. But I wasn't just taken to a new location. It was also a different time. That is to say, I traveled backwards and attended an event which occurred decades before I was even born, my grandfather's 10th birthday. My God. Are you serious? I exclaimed in disbelief. How did you know? I mean, how could you tell? Well, in truth I only really figured it out after I got back. It all happened so fast, and I was only there for 5 minutes. It seemed like longer, but 5 minutes is all I ever get. I recognized details I'd seen in old black and white photographs, and when I saw my grandfather he was the spitting image of me. But the oddest thing is, I was able to interact with my environment. I could touch the furniture, smell the candles, even taste the cake. And the people could see me too. I was nervous and so stayed at the back of the room, but a few of the kids gave me funny looks while they played. I guess they wondered who this kid in the black suit was and why he'd gate-crashed the party. But it was a birthday party and there were lots of kids around, not to mention the parents who had their hands full. So, I was able to stay in the background and just observe. Hell, I didn't even approach my grandfather in his child form. Didn't know what would happen if I did. I can't believe it, I said whilst shaking my head. How is this even possible? Beats me. Fence answered with a shrug of his shoulders. I didn't understand it at the time. Still don't really. But this is the gift I was born with, the ability to connect with the dead and travel in time to a key moment in the deceased's past, all by merely touching their cold skin. But my forays into history are only temporary. 5 minutes, that's the limit. I left my grandfather's birthday party as abruptly as I arrived, fading away from the past and being thrust back into the present. Because suddenly I found myself back at the wake with a queue of impatient mourners behind me. My mind was racing as I tried to make sense of this extraordinary tale. The implications of what Fence was saying were disturbing. But I had to learn more. How did you use this unique ability? I asked cautiously. Well, it was some time before I was able to repeat the process, Fence said with a crude smile. The average kid doesn't encounter dead bodies too often, and there were no other funerals for the next few years. But the thrill I felt that day, it didn't leave me. I couldn't just leave the experience as a one-off. That's why I took a job as a mortician's assistant when I turned 18. I raised my eyebrows, unable to contain my shock. I know what you're thinking. Fence replied with a nod. It's pretty screwed up, right? But at first my intentions were innocent enough. I wanted to test and hone my powers, of course, but there was something else too. When I touched the dead I connected with them. I could see glimpses of their past, see what kind of person they were in life. Before long I realized I could visit specific points in a person's life, key moments which shaped them. And I could change things too. I was able to interact with the environment after all. It was small things at first, minor changes and adjustments to make someone's life better. The trouble is, not all of the dead I encountered were good people. Some had done terrible things during their lives, and a few had escaped the mortal coil without punishment. I felt my stomach drop as suddenly it all came together in my head. The words almost stuck in my throat, but I had to ask the question. What can you tell me about the downtown mall massacre? I inquired. Fence sighed deeply, looking down at his boots before he finally answered. The perpetrator in my timeline was a 31-year-old man called Daniel Stone. You won't have heard of him, for reasons that will become obvious. What can I say about Mr. Stone? He was a monster obviously, but there were no obvious signs that he was capable of murder. Stone had a history of mental illness, but no documented record of violence. The man was a drifter and underachiever, unable to hold down a job or maintain a long-term relationship. Still, being a social outcast doesn't usually drive a man to murder. And then there's the nature versus nurture argument. I found nothing in Daniel's family history which could explain what he did. By all accounts, he had a stable upbringing and two loving parents. What's more, his younger sister Tara qualified as a doctor, working as a pediatrician in St. Mary's Children's Hospital. In Daniel's case, the apple had fallen very far from the tree. Fence paused his account, continuing to look down at his shoes and refusing to meet my eye. I knew the behavior of a guilty man when I saw it, and realized Fence was building up to telling me something awful. It seemed he was trying to justify whatever he'd done. But I needed to press him for more. What happened to him, Fence? I asked carefully, what did you do to Daniel Stone? The vigilante sighed again, louder this time. There followed another lengthy pause before he next spoke, his voice now starting to crack under the emotional strain. I was a sworn-in member of the SVA by the time of the massacre. Mandrake had approached me about 6 months before and I'd agreed to join his organization. I was eager to use my powers to prevent evil from occurring, but Mandrake had bigger plans for me. He told me I was special, that my powers were beyond anything he'd seen before. The boss wanted to keep me in reserve and use my powers for something big. Well, the opportunity came after the mall shooting. Stone was dead by his own hand, having taken the lives of 21 innocent souls during his mindless killing spree. Many of the victims came to my morgue, but Mandrake pulled some strings and got Stone onto my slab. It was all coming together in my head, and I didn't like the picture I was seeing. So, Mandrake's sole contribution was getting you access to the body? I asked. Not quite. He answered defensively, he gave the orders, and I followed them. And of course, there was the pep talk. Pep talk? I exclaimed, not knowing whether to feel amazed or disgusted. Fence looked me straight in the eye in that moment, a renewed intensity entering his gruff voice as he tried to turn the tables. Let me ask you something, Mr. Carter. If you could go back in time and kill a baby Hitler or Stalin, would you do it? Could you take a child's life if you knew he'd grow up to be a monster? Could you kill one to potentially save millions? I saw where Fence was going with this. He was posing an old moral dilemma, one which had previously been hypothetical, but Fence's unique powers were a game changer. Nevertheless, it was a crude analogy and I wouldn't let this stand. Daniel Stone was no Hitler, I said firmly. No, he wasn't. Fence acknowledged, but the same principle applies. By taking one life, I could save 21 people. That's the argument Mandrake sold to me. But that's still murder, I exclaimed in anger. There were other ways you could have stopped him. Like what? Fence shot back, his huge body now trembling with pent-up emotion. Don't you think I considered every other possibility before resorting to this? I only have 5 minutes, remember? And besides, it's nature over nurture. Nothing could have prevented Stone from becoming a mass killer, except his own death. I was far than convinced but felt my outburst had been unprofessional, and I certainly didn't wish to provoke Fence's anger. Apologies, I said in a conciliatory voice, please tell me what happened. Sure. Fence replied in a somber tone, I've gone this far. And I guess I'm going to hell anyway. I could tell the account was taking its toll on Fence, and I did fear a similar outcome to the Quinn fiasco. Really, I should have stopped the interview right there and then. But to my eternal shame, I pressed on. The operation began like all my previous journeys. Sure, I was as nervous as hell, but I touched Stone's cheek and was taken back to 1991. I found myself standing in Daniel Stone's bedroom, with Disney character motifs on the walls and a stars and moon mobile hanging over his crib. And there was baby Daniel, a toddler with innocent eyes and soft skin, giggling innocently as he looked up at me and smiled. I guess he didn't recognize me as a threat. Jesus. I swore in disbelief. I know. Fence replied, the guilt now evident in his voice as tears formed in his deep blue eyes. I'll admit that I almost backed out at the last minute. Seeing that infant before me, the thought of harming him went against every instinct in my body. But then I remembered Mandrake's words and thought of those 21 people whose lives would be brought to a violent end, if I didn't act. Fence sighed deeply once again, forcing himself to speak the next words. I lifted a pillow from the sideboard and held it over the baby's head. Then I pushed down, ignoring the child's muffled cries and struggles, and I didn't release the pressure until he stopped moving. I saw Fence's large body trembling and his foot tapping on the office floor. I'd known where this story was going, but hearing Fence confess to the heinous crime was truly sickening. Still, I couldn't help but feel some sympathy for the vigilante, knowing the heavy burden he carried on his shoulders. So, that was that, I said solemnly. Daniel Stone died in infancy and the downtown mall massacre never took place. Fence snorted before replying in a bitter tone. I wish it was that simple. You see, the deed was done before my 5 minutes in 1991 were up. So, I was forced to stand over the baby's corpse until the timeline corrected itself and I was pulled back into the present. That would have been tolerable, I guess, but I got the shock of my life when I saw the door to the bedroom slowly opening. I gasped before sputtering out my next question. Who is it? The boy's mother. He answered in shame. I thought I'd been quiet, but I guess she heard something. Or maybe it was just the maternal instinct. You know, it's strange, I can hardly remember any details about her appearance, the clothes she wore, how she kept her hair. All I can recall is the horror in the mother's eyes when she saw her dead boy, and the piercing scream she emitted as she ran from the doorway in a blind panic. Instinctively I sprinted after her and down the hallway. I didn't have a plan. It wasn't my intention to hurt her, that wasn't the mission. I just wanted to stop her screaming. He shook his head before clenching and unclenching his fist. It all happened so fast. We struggled at the top of the staircase, and suddenly she was falling. I reached out and tried to grab the woman, but it was already too late. She tumbled down the stairs like a bag of spuds, hitting the ground hard. Her neck snapping like a twig. I stared down at her dead eyes, frozen in horror at what I'd just done. And I was only shaken from my shock-induced trance by a furious roar from further down the corridor. I turned my head and saw the boy's father dressed in blue jeans and a white vest. The man was holding a baseball bat and cried out in bloody fury as he charged towards me while swinging his bat. I didn't resist or run, instead merely standing still as the vengeful father came at me. Frankly, I didn't care if he beat me to death given what I'd just done. But wouldn't you know it? In that very moment my journey into the past abruptly ended, and I disappeared from that place before being thrust back into the now altered present. My mind was racing and I found myself literally speechless in the moments which followed. The butterfly effect caused by Fence's time-traveling vigilantism was substantial, but it was even worse than I thought. Did you look into the Stone family after you got back? I asked sheepishly, part of me not wanting to hear the answer. I did. Fence replied reluctantly, although I wish I hadn't frankly. Still, I had to face up to what I'd done. Mr. Stone took the blame for my crimes, as he was accused of murdering his wife and infant son. At the trial he ranted and raved about a man who invaded his family home, committed the murders, and then disappeared into thin air. He was telling the truth of course, but the judge thought Mr. Stone was crazy and so committed him to a psychiatric hospital. He sighed deeply. Before continuing, the poor bastard died in there. Hung himself. That was another death on my conscience, but it's not what bothers me the most. No? I said in surprise. Afraid not. Fence confirmed with a solemn nod of his head. You see, Mrs. Stone was 3 months pregnant when she died. She was carrying Daniel's younger sister, Tara. You'll find no record of her, because in this timeline, Tara was never born, thanks to me. I robbed that girl of a chance at life. And it gets worse. Tara was a doctor in the original unaltered timeline. I'm the only one who remembers this. I often think of how many lives she would have saved during her medical career. Would her good work have offset the evil committed by her brother? Who can say? All I know is this, I played God and destroyed that family. And I had no right doing so. I looked to Fence in near astonishment. Honestly, I'd expected the vigilante to try to justify his heinous actions. And yet, Fence had admitted he was wrong, that the ends didn't justify the means in this case. But the time traveler didn't hold all the responsibility, as his next statement confirmed. Damn Mandrake, Fence exclaimed angrily, his blue eyes lighting up with a fiery intensity. Damn that son of a bitch to hell. I wish I never met him. I was still trying to think of an appropriate response to the vigilantes' strong words when we were suddenly interrupted by an almighty din and bright light emanating from the far side of the office window. Both Fence and I jumped up from our chairs, temporarily blinded by the artificial light and near deafened by the heavy noise of spinning rotor blades. Looking out, I realized a police helicopter was hovering in the night sky, directly opposite the derelict building we occupied, using its high-powered searchlight to illuminate our floor. The authorities had tracked us down, and now was the time for reckoning. "This is the police," came the call from the chopper's loudspeakers. "Get down on your knees and put your hands behind your heads." I was inclined to do as instructed. I hadn't committed any crimes after all. and the newspaper's lawyers could secure my release from custody within a matter of hours. Fentz seemed unsure, however. He faced the grim prospect of arrest and facing the consequences of his actions. I looked to my vigilante companion as the searchlight illuminated us both. Honestly, I believe he was on the verge of surrender. But then Mandrake burst back into the space, intervening in a typically violent manner. I turned my head in time to see the fanatical vigilante charging across the office floor, pulling a machine pistol from underneath his jacket as he came. "Die, you motherfuckers!" he screamed, a second before opening fire towards the chopper. The din of gunfire added to the violent cacophony of sound, and the bullets easily shattered the glass window, striking the hovering aircraft and taking out its searchlight. The chopper was unarmed and the pilot lost his nerve, retreating from the shattered window and descending into the dark skies above. Mandrake cried out in triumph as the cold night's air hit us, and he continued firing at the chopper until his magazine was empty. With the immediate threat averted, Mandrake turned towards us before and bellowed out his orders. "We need to leave. Now." Next, Mandrake holstered his weapon and pulled out his cell phone, using the torch function to light the way as he proceeded across the office floor. I looked to Fentz and saw the despair in his eyes, like he was caught in Mandrake's spell and couldn't escape it. He followed his leader and I reluctantly walked after them both, still unwilling to turn my back on this story. We exited the office and entered the internal stairwell leading downwards, only to find our path blocked. We heard the loud clumping of heavy boots on stairs and saw torches pointing upwards, lights affixed to assault rifles, and carried by black-clad SWAT team members. The cops were coming up the stairs whilst we wanted to head down. It seemed our only escape route was blocked, and there was no doubt who the cops were after. "Mandrake!" shouted the SWAT leader as he aimed his rifle upwards and caught the vigilante in his torchlight. "You're finished, asshole. Give up or I'll blow your fucking head off." I didn't see how the elusive Mandrake would escape this ambush, but of course he had another ace up his sleeve. The vigilante didn't even blink as he entered a short code into his cell phone. And a second later, all hell broke loose. There was a blinding light and deafening roar below us, clearly followed by a huge blast of hot air which threw me off my feet. I fell heavily to the ground, my head spinning and ears ringing. Fentz was the one who helped me up, offering his huge right hand and dragging me up to my feet. I was still dazed but forced myself to look down at the now burning staircase, which was covered in blood and guts. Whatever booby trap Mandrake planted had done the job, blowing the SWAT team to pieces and littering the staircase with their broken bodies. I felt sick as I observed the scene of bloody carnage below. Most of the cops were dead, but a few clung to life despite their missing limbs, crying out in agony as they slowly bled out. My jaw dropped as I turned to Mandrake in disgust, saying, "What the hell have you done?" The vigilante leader merely shrugged his shoulders dismissively, showing no remorse or even basic humanity. "Those men came here to kill me. I am entitled to act in self-defense. Every war has its casualties." I could no longer contain my disgust at Mandrake as I remonstrated with him for his callous and murderous actions. "This is all just a game to you, isn't it?" I exclaimed angrily, speaking up to be heard over the groans of the dying officers. Mandrake made a point of loading a fresh magazine into his gun as he answered coolly, "On the contrary, Mr. Carter, I take this very seriously. Justice is my life's mission and I'm prepared to die for the cause." I snorted in contempt, as the vigilante's fanatical words only increased my anger, and I spoke before I had a chance to think of the consequences. "Of course, Mandrake. You're a tough guy, right? A soldier who never backs away from the fight. But you weren't always this way, isn't that true? You see, Mandrake, I've discovered your true identity. Your real name is Seth Peterson and you grew up on the city's south side. Your father was a violent drunk who beat and molested his wife and children. One night he was hurting your little sister while you cowered under the covers. But your mother wasn't taking it anymore, was she? That night she blew your daddy's head off with a 12 gauge. Your mommy went to prison and your new sister were sent into foster case. You never stood up to your abusive father, did you, Mandrake? But you've made up for it since. This burning rage inside of you, The uncontrollable lust for bloody vengeance. That's the spark which lit the fire, and now the entire city is burning, thanks to you. My rant had been ill-advised. I'd discovered the truth about Mandrake just 3 days before and was in two minds whether to confront him with this information. But now I'd blurted it out, and there was no way of telling how the vigilante leader would react. I looked on fearfully as Mandrake's expression turned from shock to fury, his face going red with rage. I saw his grip tightening on the handle of his gun and genuinely feared Mandrake would shoot me down in cold blood. Thankfully, he regained some level of calm and composure, a crude smile returning to his weathered face as he spoke. "Well done, Mr. Carter," he said sarcastically. "I must commend your journalistic skills. You are indeed a hack of the first order. And so, my big secret has been revealed. But you see, Carter, it doesn't fucking matter. Seth Peterson died a long time ago. But Mandrake still lives, and I'll keep fighting until my dying breath." "Great speech," I replied mockingly, "but I'm not going to be your mouthpiece any longer. I'm done with this story, and I'm going home." I'd finally stood up to the feared Mandrake and felt some degree of satisfaction in that moment, but unfortunately it did not last. The vigilante boss didn't react well to my defiance, as he pointed his machine pistol towards me and spoke through clenched teeth. "I'm not done with you yet, Carter. We still have work to do, and I can't let you go." He motioned a gun towards the far end of the office floor. "There's a service elevator over there. Still functional. We're all going to leave here together." I was horrified, realizing that I'd gone from interviewer to hostage in mere seconds. I looked to Fence in that moment. He'd remained silent throughout my argument with Mandrake, and the look in his eyes told me he wasn't happy. Nevertheless, the time-traveling vigilante offered me no support as he walked towards the waiting lift without comment. And I was forced to follow him, with the gun-wielding Mandrake pushing me forwards with the barrel of his pistol poking into my back. We got into the creaky elevator and descended. The tension inside of that tight space was unbearable, as a cold sweat poured down my brow. Mandrake kept a close watch on me throughout our short descent, a killer's glint in his dark eyes. Was he going to kill me? It seemed like a distinct possibility. My mind raced as the survival instinct kicked in, and I considered attempting a desperate escape. But the dynamics of our situation changed rapidly once our elevator reached the ground floor and the doors pinged open. Looking out, we saw a figure waiting for us outside of the lift door, armed and pointing his gun towards us. It took me a second to recognize the grizzled face of the trenchcoat-wearing gunman. It was Hennessy, the PD-turned-bounty hunter who'd been on Mandrake's trail from the very beginning. And finally he'd found him. It seemed like the world froze for a tension-filled moment, but then everything happened at once, as the game of cat and mouse reached its bloody conclusion. Bang! Hennessy fired first, with a single bullet striking Mandrake in the chest. The vigilante fell backwards, mortally wounded. But with his last ounce of strength, he pulled the trigger on his gun, unleashing a burst of automatic gunfire which almost cut the bounty hunter in half. Hennessy was killed instantly, while Mandrake slumped against the elevator wall, blood pouring from his wound as he looked up at me and spluttered out his final words. "Write my story, Carter. Preserve my legacy," he whispered faintly. And then the notorious vigilante leader shut his eyes and stopped breathing. I was in a state of shock after watching the violence play out. Part of me was glad Mandrake was dead, but I couldn't help but think he'd avoided justice. "He got what he wanted," I said solemnly, "died a martyr to his cause." I'd almost forgotten that Fence was present, as he remained silent for some time. But suddenly I heard him tutting behind me, as he said, "No sir, that won't do." I turned to Fence in surprise, wondering what he meant. But then I remembered his hidden power. Fence stepped over Mandrake's corpse, instead walking over to Hennessy's body before touching him gently on his forehead. There followed a flash of light which temporarily blinded me. And when my sight was restored, the scene before me had changed dramatically. I don't know what action Fence took in the past before he was thrust back to our present. But Hennessy's body was no longer present, and Mandrake was no longer dead. The resurrected vigilante leader struggled upon shaking legs, seemingly confused and disorientated as he stumbled out of the elevator, muttering to himself as he went. "No. This can't be. This isn't right," he said. Suddenly there were loud footsteps on the floor as new figures emerged from the shadows. "Freeze, asshole. Don't you move." It was a cop, running straight towards the baffled Mandrake. The vigilante's gun was still lying on the elevator floor, and for once he was taken off guard. The officer opened fire, but with a taser rather than a gun. Mandrake was hit in the chest, his body convulsing as the volts surged through him. A second later and another cop appeared, tackling Mandrake down to the ground and securing him in handcuffs. More officers charged towards us, shouting with guns drawn. Both Fence and I surrendered without a fight, and finally the ordeal was over. And that's my story, in its entirety. I was released without charge, but my companions were caught. Banter writes. The charge list against Mandrake is the length of a novel, and he'll surely spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. As for Fence, he made a full confession and has been charged with 2 counts of murder, both committed before the killer was officially born. Another legal first. I'll admit that I was in 2 minds over whether to publish this story. I no longer care about acclaim, praise, or awards, and I do fear that I'm still doing Mandrake's bidding by spreading his infamy. But in the end, I decided this is a story which must be told, if only to allow this war-torn city to heal. I won't make any moral judgment here. Such lofty ideals seem hollow now, given all the bloodshed and suffering I've witnessed. But I will finish this article with a genuine plea for peace, and a hope that, one day, true justice will be served. Part 2. I sat upon the cold metal chair located inside of an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts. It was cold and dark, with the only illumination coming from the battery-powered lantern sitting on the table in front of me. The location was not of my choosing, and it conjured dark images in my mind. In fact, my imagination ran wild as I waited on my source. This would be the perfect place for a summary execution. For security reasons, nobody knew where exactly I was, not even my editor. I wondered whether Mandrake had chosen this venue intentionally as a means of intimidating me. But I had to trust my source, even though he was a man with a proven track record of brutal violence. Mandrake was determined to tell his story while he still had the chance, and I was the journalist he'd chosen to speak with. The vigilante leader was thinking about his legacy now, about how he'd be remembered. Knowing the man like I did, I was sure Mandrake wouldn't allow himself to be taken alive. Sooner or later, he would go down in a blaze of glory. I just hoped I wouldn't be caught in the crossfire when he did. I glanced down at my watch for what must have been the 100th time. Mandrake was over half an hour late, and I was becoming increasingly concerned by his tardiness. My mind raced with the possibilities. Had the cops or bounty hunters tracked him down? Was it all over? Or had he simply had a change of heart? Mandrake couldn't have been happy with the outcome of the Tabitha investigation. Did he blame me for what happened to her? I shivered as I sat and waited, shaking my head as I tried to dismiss my paranoia. Our previous meeting at the Sanctuary Hotel had been a risk, and I'd almost taken a bullet for my troubles. But the story I came away with was a revelation, a unique insight into a secretive vigilante group who had long operated from the shadows. I knew I was on the cusp of a huge scoop which would reveal the truth to the public and launch my career into the stratosphere. Call it vanity or stubbornness, but I couldn't walk away from this story, even though my life and liberty may be at risk. It wasn't just Mandrake and his army of fanatics I had to worry about. After the Tabitha interview went out, I'd been brought in for questioning by federal agents. They'd pressed me hard for information on the elusive Mandrake, his state of mind, how he contacted me, his current whereabouts, and so on. I'd given them the bare minimum of information, maintaining my journalistic integrity as I insisted on protecting my sources. Eventually, the newspaper's lawyers were able to get me released without charge. But the feds made it clear this wasn't over, making obscure references to anti-terrorist legislation and national security. And then there was Hennessy, the determined private investigator who'd tracked Mandrake down to the hotel. Over the previous few days I'd had the unpleasant feeling I was being followed as I went about my day-to-day business. At first I thought it was my paranoia playing up, but then I caught a glimpse of Hennessy whilst I was walking to my office. The Pi must be keeping tabs on me in the hope I will lead him to Mandrake. I'd taken all the precautions I could whilst traveling to the location that night, but I still feared the Pi would track us down. Hennessy would stop at nothing to claim the substantial bounty on Mandrake's head, which would be paid whether the target was dead or alive. He was hunting the vigilante leader down, but Mandrake could get to Hennessy too, as evidenced by a recent assassination attempt. The cops had tried to cover it up, but I'd got word of a car bomb attack on the Pi's vehicle. Thankfully for Hennessy's sake, the device had failed to detonate. Nevertheless, this was now a deadly game of cat and mouse, and I was stuck in the middle. I was still considering this dangerous situation and questioning my own sanity when I heard the ominous sound of footsteps behind me. I turned slowly and saw a figure emerging from the shadows and marching across the concrete towards me. "Mr. Carter. Please excuse my tardiness," said the familiar voice. I squinted to get a better look at the man as the light from the lantern illuminated his face. It was Mandrake, of course, but his appearance was different from the last time we'd met. Even in the unsavory environment of the squalid hotel, Mandrake had maintained his dignity and self-confidence, standing tall and immaculately turned out in his finely tailored suit. But the man I now saw before me looked like a shadow of his former self. His suit torn and stained, his face unshaven and drawn. Mandrake was clearly on edge, and even his voice seemed to have lost some of its previous authority. I wondered what had happened to the vigilante leader to pull him down. Had the pressure and stress of being on the run finally got to him? I didn't comment on his physical state, although it did concern me, particularly given the wild look present in his dark eyes. I recalled hearing how wild animals were the most dangerous when cornered, and thought this might also apply to human beings. Nevertheless, the disheveled Mandrake strode across the warehouse floor and took his seat across from me, smiling faintly as he looked me up and down. "Well, Mr. Carter, I want to thank you for coming tonight. Much has happened since our last conversation." "Indeed," I replied thoughtfully. A pause followed, as if Mandrake expected me to say more. "Have you been able to speak with her?" Mandrake eventually asked. I knew precisely who he was referring to and shook my head in the negative. "I'm afraid not. I've made repeated attempts to visit Tabitha in custody, but so far the prison authorities have blocked all my requests." Mandrake's face screwed up as he scoffed in utter contempt. "You understand now, Mr. Carter, you can see the lengths the government will go to, what they're prepared to do to maintain control, to ensure their own twisted monopoly on violence and so-called justice." I sensed that Mandrake was about to launch into one of his characteristic tirades where he attempted to justify his heinous actions. I wanted to shut him down, but in truth there was little I could say, because Tabitha's case didn't sit easy with me. I had only met the voodoo priestess briefly, but I felt like we made a connection during our short interview. I had sympathy for Tabitha after hearing her story, and the woman had shown genuine remorse when she'd handed herself in and made a full confession. Her case was indeed an interesting one, as Tabitha had used her powers to punish and ultimately kill a wife murderer. But the DA elected not to bring her to trial as they believed a conviction was unlikely. Tabitha had acted in self-defense after all, albeit in a rather unconventional way. That should have been the end of the matter, but the feds weren't willing to let Tabitha walk free, and so she was being held under anti-terrorist laws at an undisclosed location. I was certainly not a supporter of the SVA and didn't condone their activities, but I struggled to justify the government's draconian actions against them. Mandrake must have picked up on my discomfort, and he decided to press me on the matter. "You still believe we're the bad guys, don't you?" he sneered. "Surely you don't really believe the government is on the right side of this?" I took a breath, carefully considering my next words before delivering an answer. "I still believe in the system, despite its flaws." Mandrake's response to my statement surprised me, because he burst into mocking laughter. "You believe in the system?" he exclaimed. "Tell me, Carter, do you pray to the system at night?" Does the system shower you with love and devotion? Will your precious system keep you safe and warm when evil comes knocking on your door? I'll admit to acting unprofessionally as Mandrake's mocking words got under my skin. I struggled to keep my anger in check as I looked the vigilante straight in the eye and spoke through clenched teeth. Tell me, Mandrake, does your hatred keep you warm at night? A tense pause followed as the ruthless killer glared at me with his cold, dark eyes. I feared Mandrake would react with violence, but instead he formed his lips into a hideous grin before he answered. Indeed it does, Mr. Carter. The mission of righteous vengeance is my life's work. I regret nothing. His words chilled me and I could no longer meet the killer's hard gaze. I could never forget who Mandrake truly was, a violent fanatic who believed the ends always justified the means. But the man himself was something of an enigma. Mandrake was an alias and not his real name, and it had proved nearly impossible to confirm his real identity. What was his history? What made him tick? And how had he gathered an army of extraordinary people with supernatural powers to do his bidding? These were all mysteries I intended to solve, but not tonight. You have someone else for me to meet? A former SVA man with a story to tell? I asked, directing the conversation back to business. Yes. Mandrake answered with a firm nod of his head. The individual in question is waiting for you, inside the black van parked outside. You will have to meet with him alone. I must warn you, Carter, this man's unique experiences have left him somewhat damaged. He is not good around people, I'm afraid, so you might encounter some challenges with your interview. Still, I'm sure a journalist as talented as you'll be able to complete the job. I wasn't sure whether Mandrake was being sarcastic or not, but nevertheless I shakingly got up on my feet and made for the exit at the far end of the abandoned warehouse, not turning around as Mandrake called after me. Good luck, Mr. Carter. I'll be here waiting for you when you're done. I walked out the front of warehouse, shivering under the dark sky as I scanned the perimeter and quickly found the van parked at the far end of the empty parking lot. I did pause for a moment before proceeding, as I wondered why this unidentified vigilante would not leave the vehicle and come out to meet me. This was another risk, a further delve into danger, but I felt I was beyond the point of no return. With a shaking hand, I opened the sliding door on the side of the van and awkwardly climbed inside. There I found a thin and disheveled man with wild hair and heavy bags under his eyes. He glared at me with suspicion, clicking his tongue before he spoke in little more than a whisper. Please, man, close the door. I obliged, pulling the door shut and adjusting my eyes to the dark interior, with the only dim illumination coming from the small light on the front dashboard. My source remained hidden in the shadows, his bloodshot eyes glaring out at me from the darkness. I reckoned he was trying to size me up, but there was something very unsettling about his cold stare, and I felt very exposed in that moment. Nevertheless, I swallowed my anxiety and did my best to break the ice with the stranger. How are you doing, sir? I said, whilst extending my hand in friendship. My name's Carter, and I'm here to listen to your story. The man looked down at my hand as if it disgusted him, and he would not shake. I know who you are, he replied after an uncomfortable pause. In fact, I am very familiar with you, Mr. Carter. The way he said this made me even more uncomfortable, but I feigned a smile and continued the conversation. I see. Has Mandrake filled you in? Or perhaps you've read my articles? I asked. The man's eyes narrowed and he snorted in contempt before answering. Oh, I know your work, Carter. I've read the lies you've written about me and my comrades, but that's not what I mean. I didn't know the truth about you until you stepped inside this vehicle. But it's all clear to me now. I can read you like an open book, Carter. I see your arrogance, your self-righteous worldview, but most of all, I see the ugly ambition you carry with you, that drives you. You want to win a Pulitzer, right? You crave fame, recognition and fortune, and you think Mandrake and his army of freaks is your ticket to success. Does that sound about right, Mr. Carter? My jaw dropped as I stared at the vindictive man in disbelief. I felt like I'd been assaulted, with all my worst personality traits laid bare. For a moment, I was in shock, but my brain soon put the pieces together, and I realized who I was talking to. Your name is Quinn, I said with some certainty, "You're wanted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, and you can read minds." Quinn managed to produce a thin smile on his dry lips as he clicked his fingers. "You got it in one, Carter," he confirmed. "No wonder you're a journalist." My feelings in that moment were mixed. I was nervous to be in the presence of yet another ruthless killer, especially one who was clearly hostile towards me. Nevertheless, I also felt excitement, because the man before me was infamous, and his story would be a huge scoop. I desperately wanted to progress with the interview but knew I'd need to proceed with caution. "Well, Mr. Quinn, I understand you don't like me. And perhaps you have a point. I do hope to progress my career through this story. But that doesn't mean our arrangement can't be mutually beneficial. You and your comrades want the world to hear your side of the story, and I can give you this audience." It was a cynical ploy, but an honest one. I believed this was my best path, because Quinn would know if I lied to him. However, he seemed less than impressed by my pitch as he sighed deeply and rolled his eyes. Nevertheless, he opened up to me and agreed to answer my questions. "Why don't you start at the beginning?" I said. "When did you first become aware of your special abilities?" "My curse, you mean?" Quinn snarled. "I guess I was born with it. I remember a muddle of thoughts and voices in my head from a young age. It used to upset me greatly until I learned how to manage and understand these thoughts, which I realized were not my own. Now, you've surely heard of highly empathetic people who are able to pick up on emotions and read body language. That's a real thing, but it's not what I do. People like me are few and far between, because we can actually read people's thoughts. And I don't just know what goes through a person's head at a given moment. I know their dreams, their secrets, and their plans." He sighed, taking a deep breath before continuing. "The first time it really hit home was shortly after my 10th birthday. I tried not to read the thoughts of my parents and sister. Even at a young age, I realized this was an invasion of privacy. My curse isn't like a tap, and I can't switch it off altogether. But I've learned ways of drowning out the noise, at least when I'm in small groups. Still, around that time I realized something was off with my dad. He wasn't acting like himself and I was genuinely worried about him. That's why I decided to listen in. Well, to cut a long story short, I found out he was cheating on my mom. It was devastating to learn the secret at such a young age, and I didn't know how to deal with it. Eventually I did confront my father once I realized he intended to leave us for his mistress. Dad was shocked when I told him what I knew, and he couldn't understand how I'd found him out. I could hear the emotion in Quinn's voice and realized this was a painful memory for him to recount. I considered telling him how sorry I was, but I doubted he'd believe me. "So, tell me, Mr. Quinn, how did you end up joining the SVA? How did Mandrake find you?" Quinn snorted, the thin smile returning to his lips and a spark lighting up in his dark eyes. "Actually, Mandrake didn't find me. I sought him out and offered my services to his organization." I raised my eyebrow, puzzled but eager to learn more. "The incident which changed my life's trajectory happened when I was a freshman in college. I guess I had mastered my powers by this age, as far as was possible. I was never good in large groups or crowds. The cacophony of thoughts could be enough to overwhelm my senses. Relationships were always difficult. There is such a thing as knowing too much about someone. But I'm not going to talk about that. One thing I learnt after my father's betrayal was this: it's the dark secrets that weigh a person down. The anger and obsession, the guilt and anxiety, this is what comes to the fore. Those wicked thoughts tend to be the strongest. Well, that's what I discovered the hard way. I knew this story wouldn't end well, but I needed to learn more, and so I urged Quinn to go on. "Well, there was this girl I was seeing. Jenny was her name," he explained. "We went out together for a while. I really liked her, but it didn't last. Unfortunately, intimacy is difficult for me compared to normal people. But I'm not getting into it." Quinn emitted yet another heavy sigh and I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. "Well, anyway, Jenny started seeing this other guy who lived in our dorm. The guy's name was Carl and he was on the football team. You know the type, a jock, Popular, handsome, and confident. Sure, I was jealous, but it was more than that. I sat behind Carl in class and started reading his mind. On the surface he was cool and charming, but Carl carried a rage inside of him. He was insecure and paranoid and took his anger out on Jenny. I knew he'd gotten physical with her and reckoned it would only get worse. But what could I do? Well, I still believed in the rules back then. I spoke to campus security and they were no help. Then I went to the cops, but there was no evidence, and what could I tell them? In the end, Jenny wound up in hospital. She survived but with permanent nerve damage and who knows what kind of mental trauma. Carl was eventually arrested but got off with a bullshit probation. So, as you can guess, this didn't sit right with me. I knew I had this power, more of a curse than a gift. But still, I realized that I could do some good, that I could prevent crimes yet to happen. My mission would be to save the innocent and punish the guilty. That's why I sought out Mandrake and joined the SVA. I nodded my head in understanding. Quinn's journey towards vigilantism made sense now. Whether it was morally justified or not was another question, however. So, can you tell me what work you did for the SVA? I inquired cautiously. It didn't always come to murder. Quinn explained, sometimes the target just got a warning. Other times, a beating or kneecapping. But we didn't hesitate to take out hardened killers or child molesters. They were fair game. At first I worked with others in the organization, but after a while I hunted alone. Hunted? I interjected in shock. Sure, Quinn said with a wicked smile on his lips. What else would you call it? I paused for a moment as I carefully considered my next question. But this was of course pointless, because Quinn knew what I was going to ask. Before I did, you want to hear about the Hall murder? That's why you're here, right? I nodded my head, unable to hide my enthusiasm. What happened that night, Quinn? I asked. The vigilante stared at his feet for a long time. I feared Quinn might not tell his sorry tale, but eventually he did speak up. It was a standard operation. A random hunt. That's to say, I wasn't chasing a specific target. Instead, I frequented a dive bar on the wrong side of the tracks. This was an establishment where shady characters and low-level criminals were known to hang out. Now, normally I hate going inside of crowded places. The background noise is too much. But, when you're on a hunt, you need to filter out the BS and home in on your target. So, that's how you identified Mr. Hall? I interjected. Yeah. Quinn confirmed with a nod, but he wasn't the only monster I found that night. I frowned in confusion, as this story wasn't going the way I expected. What do you mean? I asked in confusion. I had my target that night. Hall was one evil bastard. But you knew that, right? What he did to his own daughter. I nodded my head as the vile details of the case came to mind. Mr. Hall was a monster in plain sight, a prolific pedophile of the worst kind. It was difficult to argue he hadn't deserved his fate. Imagine how I felt when I looked inside that twisted monster's mind. I saw what he'd done, what he planned to do. It took everything in me not to beat him to death right there in the bar. But this wasn't my first rodeo and I knew what needed to be done. I would wait until Hall left the bar, follow him out, and put the animal down. Easy, right? Well, I was waiting patiently at the bar when I picked up the frequency of a second target. Another criminal? I exclaimed. That's right. Quinn confirmed, 2 scumbags on the one night. What are the odds? The second man was called Sanchez. He came in around 10-ish and started hitting the bottle hard. I could tell the guy was on edge, and so, against my better judgment, I listened in. What was he thinking? I prompted. Sanchez was thinking about murder. Quinn answered coldly, the guy wasn't exactly a gangster. He was a businessman who'd fallen on hard times and had been stealing from the company accounts. His partner found out and threatened to go to the cops. Well, you can probably guess the rest of it. Sanchez was desperate and had a loaded gun in his pocket. He planned to kill his business partner that very night and was working up to doing it, using the booze for some Dutch courage. Jesus! I swore, hardly believing what I was hearing. Yeah, you can see my conundrum, Quinn said. Some might call it an Impossible decision. I had two targets in the same bar, both planning to commit horrific acts on that very night. One would return home and do unspeakable things to his daughter, and the second was going out to kill an innocent man. I considered asking Quinn what he chose to do, but I already knew the answer. If I had more time I would have called in a second hitman, Quinn continued solemnly, but Hall went to leave 2 minutes later. I needed to make a split-second decision, and that's what I did. Quinn paused again, swallowing as he broke off eye contact. There's no way I could let that child abuser walk away, and so I followed him out onto the street. I sat forward, enthralled by Quinn's account and hanging on his every word. I waited until he was on his own, cornering him on an empty side street. Hall wasn't a big guy, but I was taking no chances. There's no way of knowing how someone will react when they're taken by surprise. But, as it turned out, I needn't have worried, because the bastard was nothing more than a coward. I saw the twisted smile on Quinn's crusty lips and it brought a cold chill up my spine. I came up behind him with my trusty stiletto in hand. It wasn't the first time I'd done this, so I used a tried and tested technique to overcome the target. I grabbed the bastard from behind, holding my knife to his throat and covering his mouth with my gloved hand. Hall squealed like a pig and tried to break free, but I held him tight and drew blood from his exposed neck. "Don't make a sound," I whispered to him. "Don't resist, or I'll slit your fucking throat." Hall froze in terror and I used my brute strength to drag him off the street and down a dark alley. I didn't miss a beat as I threw the bastard down onto the trash cans, experiencing a grim satisfaction as I watched him squirm in the dirt. Hall tried to get back on his feet, but I punched him hard in the stomach and pinned him against the wall. The coward pleaded for his life, saying he could give me money. I guess he thought it was a mugging, but I soon set the creep straight. "I know what you've done, Mr. Hall," I told him. "I know your secret. Now is the time for your reckoning, you sick fuck." Quinn paused for a moment and smiled. Not my best sign-off, but the words had the desired effect. I took pleasure in my target's reaction, his eyes widening in sheer terror once he realized the game was up. And I didn't hesitate, stabbing him repeatedly in the chest and stomach. It was a frenzied attack, to be honest, as I totally lost control and cut the bastard to pieces. He sighed and lowered his head. "Well, you saw the crime scene photos, Carter." I had, and the brutality of the murder was undeniable. I allowed myself a moment to watch Hall bleed out, Quinn continued. "And then I fled from the scene. Normally I would go straight to a safe house and destroy all forensic evidence linking me to the crime. Everything was prepared in advance. But that night was different. I thought there was still time, you see. I believed I could stop Sanchez from murdering his business partner, if I acted fast." "You went back there?" I asked excitedly. "Yeah." Quinn replied with a nod. "It was a crazy move, and I was putting myself at risk. My clothes were covered in Hall's blood and I would certainly be charged with murder if the cops caught me. But I had to try." "What happened at the bar?" I asked. "He'd already left," Quinn confirmed solemnly, "but I didn't give up. I had an image in my head, a thought stolen from Sanchez's mind. There was a gas station which I recognized, not far from the barroom. I knew Sanchez's plan and realized this was where he intended to ambush his target. Well, I jumped into my car and drove there without delay. But I'm afraid I was already too late." I could see Quinn's emotions were getting the better of him and swore I could see a teardrop forming in the corner of his eye. I arrived to Bedlam. There were cops all over the forecourt and an ambulance parked on the sidewalk. I saw the victim's car, a black BMW, riddled with bullets. I was parked at the end of the street but could only watch as the paramedics took a badly wounded man out from the driver's seat. There was a woman sitting on the curb with a cop standing over her. She didn't seem to be hurt, but her clothes and face were covered in blood, and her eyes were wide with shock. They loaded the man onto a stretcher and rushed him to the ambulance. He was still alive but in a bad way. Still, I thought the victim might pull through. But a moment later and they opened the back door and removed a second body with half his head blown away. The backseat passenger was only a child, 11 or 12 at the most. Clearly the kid was dead. And when the woman saw him, she screamed. Bloody murder, collapsing down to the asphalt as the grief overcame her. I felt sick to my stomach as reality hit home, and a guilt latched onto me that would never let go. My God, I exclaimed in genuine shock. I thought back to the night of Hall's murder and recalled the fatal shooting, which had occurred on the same night. I hadn't made the connection between the two incidents at the time, assuming they were unrelated acts of violence. But now it all made sense. So, I said carefully, "You killed a man to save a child. But another kid died because of my decision." Quinn shot back bitterly. "I don't condone what you did, but you can't hold yourself responsible for that boy's death. You didn't shoot him." "True," Quinn replied, "and perhaps I could have lived with the guilt. But unfortunately, this wasn't the end of it." I raised my eyebrow, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I eagerly awaited the conclusion of Quinn's extraordinary tale. Sanchez was caught by the cops before we could get to him. They had enough evidence to bury him, and the judge rightly gave the bastard the death penalty. He's still waiting on his sentence to this day, in fact. Well, the whole episode hit me hard. I got the usual pep talk from Mandrake, but the guilt was eating away at me. Honestly, I'd had my fill of death and violence, and was ready to give up on the vigilante business. I went off the rails and started drinking heavily. This was the only way I could drown out the voices invading my consciousness. But the alcohol also dulled my natural defenses, so I didn't see her coming and didn't realize she'd broken into my apartment. "Who was she?" I inquired impatiently. "The woman from that night," he replied solemnly, "the grieving mother on the sidewalk. Her son was dead and her husband in a coma, and the grief had driven her insane. She must have seen me that night and put two and two together. I don't know how she found me. Perhaps she had her own powers of intuition or deduction. Well, in any case, she got the drop on me." "What did she want?" I asked. Quinn snorted before answering aggressively. "What the hell do you think? She wanted fucking revenge." "But why you?" I demanded. "You weren't." "I wasn't responsible." Quinn interjected. "I didn't kill her son." "Sure, that's true. But I could have saved the kid. I could have chosen differently and prevented the shooting. It was an impossible choice." I replied with genuine sympathy. "Perhaps. But the grieving mother didn't see things that way. Her son's killer was in prison, awaiting the lethal injection. But this wasn't enough. She needed someone to blame, a target to lash out at. In her mind I played God that night, having chosen to save another child over hers. I could argue about the moral dilemma, but ultimately she was right. I had no acceptable defense when I came home drunk and found her in my front room, pointing a gun at my chest. "What happened next?" I asked. Clearly this was difficult for Quinn and I really should have shown some patience, but I needed to drag the truth out of him, one way or another. We had a short and tense conversation, but I don't remember the exact details. Quinn replied, "I asked her how she found me, begged her for forgiveness. But I knew it was no good. I could see into her heart, and all she had left was rage and an overwhelming desire for revenge. It didn't matter that I wasn't her son's killer. I had made a decision which had resulted in her child's death, and for that crime, I had to die. But she didn't go through with it though." I interrupted. "You survived." "Evidently. Only by blind luck," Quinn said with an ironic grin. "She aimed the pistol in my face and pulled the trigger, but all I heard was an empty click. Her gun jammed, you see. Pure chance, that's what saved my life. But the mother wasn't going to let me go. She charged towards me and tried to smash the butt of her gun into my face. I reacted on instinct and dodged the attack. There was a struggle. She was crazed and wild, but I had the advantage in physical strength. I got her pinned to the ground, but still she wouldn't give up. And I knew what was in her mind. The grieving mother would keep coming after me if I let her go. Nothing would alleviate her rage. I made another fateful decision in that moment, as I put my hands around her throat and squeezed hard, and I didn't stop squeezing until the light went out from her eyes. My jaw dropped as I considered the horrifying conclusion to Quinn's story. I couldn't help but feel sympathy for the vigilante as I saw the impact this confession had upon him. his body now trembling and tears rolling down his cheeks. Before our meeting that night, I thought of Quinn as a ruthless killer without remorse, but now I saw the heavy toll this life had taken, leaving him as a mere shadow of his former self. "You had no choice," I muttered sympathetically. I didn't really mean those words, but I felt compelled to say something. But my attempt to reassure the devastated Quinn was unsuccessful. "That's what I keep telling myself," muttered Quinn, "but the truth is, I can't live with what I've done." I opened my mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. And in the end, Quinn brought our meeting to an abrupt conclusion. "Well, Mr. Carter, you got what you wanted, your precious story. Now, get the hell out and leave me be." I sensed Quinn's hostility and believed it would be in my best interests to exit the vehicle. But I feared for the man's welfare and felt I needed to at least try to reach him. "Listen, Quinn. You're not a bad person. You've done some terrible things. But it's not too late to make amends. Turn yourself in, I'm begging you." Quinn sneered, leaning forward so I could see his face clearly under the dim, artificial light. His teary eyes were filled with sorrow and regret but also anger. Next, he reached into his jacket and slowly withdrew a silver revolver, making me recoil in fear. "I won't tell you again, Carter," he snarled whilst brandishing the gun. "Get the fuck out, unless you want to become my final victim." I didn't need to be told again, raising my hands defensively before I slid the door open and leapt out of the van and onto the asphalt. One didn't need to be a mind reader to know what Quinn had planned, and so I sprinted across the dead ground whilst shouting for help. "Mandrake! Come quickly!" The vigilante leader charged out of the warehouse, pulling a pistol from his shoulder holster as he came. But a moment later, we heard the muffled sound of a gunshot from inside the van. My stomach dropped as I slowly turned around to face the vehicle. Meanwhile, Mandrake shoved past me and opened the van's side door. I guess there was a small chance that Quinn had survived, but all hope was lost when we witnessed the grisly scene within. Because there was Quinn's lifeless body sprawled in the rear, his brains blown out in the smoking revolver still clutched in his right hand. "Jesus!" I swore in shock. I turned away from the body, looking back to Mandrake and seeing a raw grief in his bloodshot eyes. "Another man down," he muttered grimly. "I'm sorry, Mandrake," I replied, "he deserved better." He scoffed in disgust and turned towards me with an angry look on his face. The vigilante opened his mouth but didn't get a chance to speak, as suddenly we were both startled by the sound of sirens. "Shit!" Mandrake swore, as he turned to see the flashing blue lights in the distance. "Time to go, Carter. I've given you another scoop to count towards your Pulitzer. But we're not done yet, my friend. I have one more person for you to meet. One last story to complete the saga." He shot me a wicked smile and winked before turning on his heels and fleeing from the scene. I paused for a brief moment, casting one final look at Quinn's body before I ran in the opposite direction. The Mentalist story received wide acclaim and international attention upon its publication. My editor was ecstatic and there was talk of a lucrative book deal to come. But, despite the success of the story, I'll confess that my heart is no longer in this investigation. Since that fateful night I've been thinking about Quinn and what he said to me, about how I was only pursuing this story to further my own career. Was he right? What am I trying to achieve here? I don't know anymore. But I see Quinn's bloody corpse every time I close my eyes. My instincts tell me to walk away from the SVA investigation, but that's not going to happen. I've come this far and feel compelled to move forward. When Mandrake calls, I will go to meet him one last time. I'm going to finish this story, even if it kills me. Credit, Woundlicker.